When I say Chicago-style pizza, what comes to mind? It's probably this: deep dish, cheese and sauce bubbling an inch deep. This is an icon of Chicago, absolutely. But what if I told you that this is also Chicago-style pizza? There's more in the Windy City than just deep dish. This is a Chicago thin crust pizza, which is cut into party-style squares. And then there's also this, which hails from a restaurant called Pequod's. See that black crusty edge? That's a ring of caramelized cheese. Good pizza is a beautiful thing, and it's hard to find good Chicago-style pizza outside of Chicago. Well, lucky for us, these pizzas are some of the easiest to make at home, and I'm going to show you how to make all three of these. I invite you to pick the one that looks best to you and follow along. Let's eat Chicago-style pizza. The recipes for this video come from an awesome website, realdeepdish.com, which has a great set of articles and recipes that we can follow to get a fairly authentic taste of Chicago in our home kitchens. All of the doughs use the same basic ingredients: flour, yeast, salt, water, oil, and sugar in slightly different proportions for each. Corn oil is traditional. This ingredient, corn oil, helps us dispel the most common myth about deep dish pizza. There is no cornmeal in the dough. The misconception of cornmeal in deep dish likely stems from the fact that you might get a little bit of a corn flavor from the corn oil, or the crust might be yellow due to added food coloring, or they might sprinkle the bottom of some pizzas with semolina flour. But to be clear, none of the traditional Chicago deep dish restaurants use cornmeal in their pizza, so neither do these recipes. The mixing process is the same for all the doughs. Just combine all the ingredients and knead together for about 3 to 5 minutes. The dough should have a fairly smooth appearance when you're done kneading it. As with any homemade dough, you might find you need to add a little more water or flour to get the right consistency, but it doesn't have to be perfect. Chicago-style dough isn't too picky. Once the dough's together, cover it with plastic wrap or a towel and let it sit in a warm place to rise for 2 hours. You might find your dough rises pretty quickly, or if it's colder in your kitchen, it can take longer. But again, Chicago style isn't very picky. 2 hours should be just fine. While the dough is rising, set the oven to 500 degrees, and if you happen to have a baking stone, definitely use it. You'll get a much crispier crust with it. Time to prep the dough. The pan I'm using for the deep dish is just a heavy-duty cake pan. Dark colored metal is better for deep dish, but this will work just fine. Grease up the pan with oil and start pressing down the dough. This is where deep dish really shines. You don't have to worry about stretching or tossing the dough. Nope, you just press it into the pan, all the way up to the edges and up the sides, about an inch high. You can see this dough is pressed out pretty thinly, and this helps debunk another popular myth of deep dish. The crust is not thick. There's a tendency to think that deep dish has thick crust, but that's not the case at all, as any Chi-Town native will tell you. For the Pequod style pizza, I'm going to use a cast iron skillet, and cast iron is great for a lot of baking and cooking, but it does retain and radiate a lot more heat than a cake pan will, so if you use cast iron, set the oven temperature about 50 degrees lower when you bake. And again, just press the dough out, but not all the way up the edges, just on the bottom. For the thin crust pizza, this dough is prepared more like a New York or Italian style, where you press it out a little bit and stretch it or roll it out with a rolling pin, toss it up in the air if you're feeling brave, spread it out to about 14 to 16 inches. For the pan, you could use a dark colored baking sheet, which would work okay, but if you have a round perforated pan, or better yet a pizza screen, that will give you the best results. Now for the toppings. For pizza, you're probably used to putting on a thin layer of tomato sauce, and then the cheese, and then your meat and other toppings. Chicago style shakes this up a bit. In the deep dish, first we lay down the cheese, mozzarella, thinly sliced. Using sliced cheese instead of shredded is especially important for the Pequod style. Here we lay down the cheese slices all the way up the edge of the pan. When those melt, this is what gives us those dark, crusty, caramelized edges. And the cheese does act as a sort of barrier to protect the crust from getting soggy from the wet tomatoes, so when you lay the cheese down, the pieces should overlap and cover the entire surface of the crust. Next up are the toppings, which we put on the bottom. so they're not toppings, they're bottomings. Anyway, if you want pepperoni, you lay it down right here at the very bottom. Sausage is probably the most traditional meat for deep dish. You can use a pre-made Italian sausage or follow the recipe from Real Deep Dish, which is super easy to make. You just mix ground pork with some spices. Now, tomatoes. Crushed or pureed canned tomatoes will give you the best results. You can use the tomatoes straight from the can with no seasoning if you happen to have some really good canned tomatoes that taste good on their own. Or if you need some more flavor, follow the recipe for the tomato sauce from Real Deep Dish, which, like the sausage, is super easy to make. Just add some herbs and spices. You'll put on a pretty heavy amount of tomatoes until everything is covered. Finish off with some Parmesan cheese, and it's good to go. The topping process is exactly the same for the Pequod style. Add the meat or other toppings, I'm just using sausage here, and then the sauce, and you can finish this one off with Parmesan as well, if you like. For the thin crust style, this one is topped more like other non-Chicago pizza. Spread out some sauce, and then sprinkle on cheese. I'm using mozzarella and provolone, and sausage, and any other toppings if you want, and that's it. The thin crust goes into the oven at 500 degrees and will take about 12 to 15 minutes. For the deep dish and Pequod style, these take a lot longer to bake, so we will lower the oven temperature to 450 and bake for about 35 to 45 minutes. You'll know that they're done when the edges and bottoms of the crust are golden brown. And here you have Chicago-style pizza, 3 ways. Easy to make and pretty cheap too. You'd probably be paying upwards of $20 or more for pizzas like this in Chicago. Make them at home and they'll easily be less than half that cost. They're not perfectly authentic, but they definitely are some of the best pizzas you'll ever have, and they'll be from your own kitchen. On that note, I really think it's a shame that pizza has been downgraded to being a cheap takeout meal. Like many baked goods, pizza is a food that is so much better when it's fresh out of the oven. Even delivery sitting in a cardboard box for 15 minutes takes a lot out of the quality of pizza. But one thing that makes pizza special, regardless of how fresh it is that we share it. Especially Chicago-style pizza. You don't order a deep dish pizza just for yourself. You really only get this kind of pizza when you go out with a group of friends or with your family. In a day and age like today where most of us are trying so hard to be independent and self-sufficient on our own, a good deep dish pizza reminds us that life is best when we're sharing, and when we're stuffing our faces with good homemade food. That helps too.